I was really worried from the beginning about basically becoming this sort of decider of what is true in the world, right? That's like kind of a crazy position to be in for billions of people using your service.
That, of course, a suddenly jacked Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg telling Joe Rogan what sent him down the path towards ending fact-checking in favor of an X-like community notes strategy. It's the latest in a Meta MAGA makeover we're seeing seemingly on a daily basis. The nearly 3-hour interview viewed 6.5 million times thus far and gave us a glimpse of the, quote, real Mark. Zuck talked about fighting, hunting, even with a bow and arrow, and of course, masculinity. I watched all 3 hours, so you don't have to. Here to talk about it is the host of Politico's Tech podcast, Stephen Overly. Stephen, good to see you. What to you stood out? What surprised you about this new real Mark?
There was a lot to pick through here in this 3 hours. I think to me, the comments he made about American companies, including Meta, being neutered, this idea that you need more of a masculine culture, more masculine energy infused back into companies was pretty illuminating. I thought it sort of spoke to all of the policy and, policies he's changing at Meta. Those comments I thought really kind of encapsulated his thinking here, and pinning down his thinking at times is difficult. So that was pretty illuminating to me.
So the real headline here was Zuckerberg telling Rogan how the Biden administration essentially bullied Meta during COVID. Listen.
These people from the Biden administration would call up our team and scream at them and curse, and it's like these documents it's all kind of out there.
Oh, did you record any of those phone calls?
I don't think we but I think
I want to listen.
I mean, there are emails. the emails are published. It's all kind of out there, and they're like, and basically it just got to this point where we were like, no, we're not gonna take down things that are true. That's ridiculous.
Okay, so Stephen, President Biden and his staff actually yelling at Meta executives to take down factual, even facetious information. What do you make of that?
This has been a charge from Meta, from Twitter, ever since it was taken over by Elon Musk and rebranded as X, that the Biden administration was overzealous, especially during COVID, in taking down misinformation from social media to the point that information that was really just opinion-driven or may ultimately have turned out to be factual was removed, or at least these companies were pressured to remove it. I mean, this is an issue that has gone all the way through the Supreme Court, which ultimately did not find that there was sort of this great collusion or kind of great strong-arming on the part of the Biden administration. But nevertheless, it speaks to the pressure that tech companies have been under. I should say, though, that pressure really began before the Biden administration. Before it was pressure on COVID, there was pressure about Russian misinformation and disinformation on Meta and other social media platforms. And so this is a phenomenon that maybe was kicked up during the COVID times. And I think really folks like Mark Zuckerberg are most aggrieved by the government's actions during COVID. But nevertheless, it is a pressure that these companies have been under even before Biden became president.
Was it a gradual approach that led Zuckerberg to stop fact-checking, or was this simply a last-second effort to continue to cozy up to Trump?
It's interesting. I mean, he is framing this as sort of him standing up for free speech, sort of reinforcing long-held beliefs at Meta. Ultimately, Meta's policies have ebbed and flowed and changed over time, often in response to political pressure. And so I don't think it is a coincidence that these changes are happening at the same time that President Trump is about to come into office. Let's remember that President Trump has been very critical of Meta and of Mark Zuckerberg in particular. He has threatened to jail Mark Zuckerberg for life if the company does not change its ways. And so there are a lot of grievances that incoming President Trump has towards this company. They know that. And so a lot of these policies, quite transparently, frankly, are being implemented in response to President Trump and his supporters and their longstanding criticisms of Meta. And so prime example of that is Mark Zuckerberg recently saying they would end their fact-checking program. They want to relocate their trust and safety team from California, which is a liberal state, to Texas, which is a conservative state. I mean, ultimately, all of this is messaging directly at the president and incoming administration officials that Meta is a changed company and that it is not the same sort of threat to Trump that he maybe once thought it was. And even in the rollout of these changes, I think that's very apparent. Meta executives have gone on Fox News, for instance, which is obviously a favored channel of the president. Even this interview on Joe Rogan's podcast is meant to appeal to a more conservative or Trump-leaning audience. And so Meta is very savvy in its messaging, is very savvy in its timing. And so I do not think that you can sort of divorce these changes from the fact that we're going to have a Trump presidency here in just a few days.
And what happens when you have a 3-hour podcast? Sometimes you say things you might not have intended to. I think that's what happened with Zuckerberg taking some shots at Apple and their lack of innovation. Here that is.
They have used that platform to put in place a lot of rules that I think feel arbitrary and feel like, they haven't really invented anything great in a while. And it's like Steve Jobs invented the iPhone, and now they're just kind of sitting on it 20 years later. And, they actually, I think year over year, I'm not even sure they're selling more iPhones at this point. I think like the sales might actually be declining. I think part of it is that each generation, it doesn't actually get that much better. So people are just taking longer to upgrade than they would before. So the number of sales, I think, has generally been flat to declining.
Why do you think Zuckerberg decided to criticize Tim Cook and Apple? Is he trying to coax the Trump administration into cracking down on Apple's model?
I mean, certainly that would be sort of a very politically calculated move on his part, if that is in fact the case. I mean, on the one hand, I thought some of his comments on Apple were surprising and unvarnished. Him saying that the company really hasn't had a hit since the iPhone and since Steve Jobs was CEO. Obviously a pretty deep dig at Apple. But some of the other grievances that he talked about in the interview, for instance, the fees that Apple imposes on apps that are downloaded through its app store, those are criticisms that Apple has faced from other companies too, not just Meta, not just Mark Zuckerberg. There are also criticisms that have been brought to Washington regulators. Apple, through its app store, has been accused of sort of operating a monopoly and having too much control over the smartphone market and the app market. And so, those criticisms are ones that are shared by others in the tech industry, those at least who create apps that are primarily offered through the iPhone and through other smartphones. And so I don't know, certainly Mark Zuckerberg is calling attention to those issues and those criticisms of Apple, but they're not going to be news to the government. They won't be news to the Trump administration. And so whether Trump decides to do anything about that or his antitrust officials decide to do anything about that is one issue. But this certainly won't be, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg's appearance on Joe Rogan is necessarily going to launch a federal investigation. But I could be surprised, I guess.
It is a must-watch inside the Trump circle, I can tell you that. The majority of the 3 hours was actually devoted to various forms of fighting, jiu-jitsu and UFC, even hunting, and as you can imagine, masculinity. Listen to this.
Obviously, society has plenty of that, but I think corporate culture was really like trying to get away from it. And I do think that there's just something, it's like, I don't know, all these forms of energy are good. And I think having a culture that like celebrates the aggression a bit more has its own merits that are really positive. And that has been a kind of a positive experience for me.
Okay, so what do you make of Zuckerberg suggesting that we need more masculinity in the workplace?
Well, let's not forget that Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk have sort of threatened to have it out in the ring in the past. And so we've seen this over the years as Mark Zuckerberg has sort of promoted his hobbies, which include things like boxing and surf, wakeboarding and other things that he's clearly rebranded, so to speak. I do think his comments about corporate America being neutered and the need for kind of a more masculine culture inside companies were pretty revealing. I mean, this coincides with Meta, for instance, rolling back some of its DEI initiatives. You know, one of the big headlines was about the company removing tampons from men's restrooms, which was an effort that had been put in place years ago in sort of response to trans advocates and the trans rights movement. And so clearly, this is a signaling from Zuckerberg that the way he runs his companies is going to be different. I do think you have seen and will continue to see some pushback to that, though. I mean, fundamentally, the tech sector is still predominantly male. It is still predominantly white. And, you know, in the case of tech, especially, you know, DEI initiatives, a lot of folks will tell you, are not sort of a nice to have program or a nice to have initiative. These do have real impacts on these companies' bottom lines. Ultimately, a lot of their users are women or people of color. And so building products with those audiences in mind can be important to their business. There are also ways in which, you know, data privacy, facial recognition, other technologies, you know, can be harmful to certain communities, including women and people of color. And so I think this will be something to really watch, is sort of to what degree does Mark Zuckerberg, you know, change Meta to be a more masculine company, whatever that means, and does that have a direct effect on their products and on their performance? You know, ultimately, one thing that sort of stood out to me is for all of Zuckerberg talking about, you know, how companies have been neutered, talking about how, you know, Meta has been censoring certain political viewpoints. This is still a very successful company financially. And so, you know, all of these policies that he's now changing do not seem to have fundamentally hurt Meta's business, at least when it comes to the financials of the company.
Okay, so Joe Rogan has, well, let me look here, about 15 million subscribers. He is clearly the most powerful man in media, not necessarily the most prepared. Listen to this.
This administration uniquely has felt the impact of not being able to have free speech, because this is the administration where Trump was famously kicked off of Twitter. That was a huge issue, like after January 6th. Like they removed at the time, the sitting president. It was kind of crazy to remove that person from social media because you've decided that he incited a riot.
So that's Rogan talking about how Twitter kicked off President Trump off the platforms without mentioning or without knowing that Zuckerberg actually removed him from all Meta platforms because of January 6th, because there was a risk to public safety. Could Joe Rogan have not known the central fact of that interview?
I mean, I can't necessarily speak to Joe Rogan's, you know, research. It is a significant oversight. I mean, ultimately, Trump was kicked off of Twitter. He was also kicked off of Meta platforms, as you said, in response to January 6th. That is one of the reasons I think that President Trump has been so chagrined with this company and with Mark Zuckerberg in particular. I think it also points to, again, an example of Meta responding to political pressure. You know, after the January 6th insurrection, there was a lot of pressure on Meta to remove Trump from the platform. There were a lot of accusations that Trump's posts had very clearly violated terms of service and community guidelines that Meta had put in place. And ultimately, Meta, for better or worse, did succumb to that political pressure and kicked him off the platform. And so, you know, this is a company that, whether it's, you know, by conviction or not, is very responsive to public opinion and political opinion. And so, you know, that factoid about Trump being kicked off the platform is very clear evidence of that, I think.
All right, a couple of topics that I'm sure will come up on your podcast before you go. Elon Musk buying TikTok. How likely is that?
You know what? I was surprised, I think, as a lot of folks to read that headline. I think China agreeing to sell TikTok, and specifically agreeing to sell TikTok with its algorithm in place, would be pretty surprising. It is something that China has said flat out they will not do. if they do agree to sell to Musk, I think it raises a few very key questions. One of which is, you would then have Elon Musk owning TikTok and X, two very large and influential social media platforms. That certainly has a lot of implications for politics and political discourse online. It may also have implications for market competitiveness and antitrust. And so I think there will be a lot of questions about the social media market if Elon does come to own both of these companies. Two, obviously, Elon Musk has this very close relationship with Donald Trump. Selling the platform to Elon Musk on China's part would not only seem, like a business decision, it would also appear to be a political decision as well. And so, there's only a few days left of TikTok, assuming it is in fact banned on January 19th. That would be a pretty fast timeline for China to agree to a sale and Elon Musk to agree to buy it. But I, like every other tech reporter, will be watching that very closely.
Indeed you will, and talking about it on the pod. And final question, Elon, Bezos, Zuckerberg, all going to the Trump inauguration, sitting near the cabinet and other elected officials. Your thoughts?
I mean, this is to be expected at this point because for weeks now, ever since the election, Silicon Valley has made a number of overtures to Trump. All of those executives you named and many others, including Apple CEO Tim Cook, have traveled to Mar-a-Lago for private meetings with Trump. They've all given, $1 million to his inauguration fund. And so I covered the tech industry's response to the first Trump administration, when there was a lot of resistance to his policies. There was a lot of hesitancy to really work with Trump on the part of these companies. That is gone now. All of these companies are fully embracing Donald Trump's presidency. They are working very hard to get on his good side because they realize if you're not on his good side, then good luck to you. And so, the fact that they are cozying up to this administration, I think, is to be expected. I think the degree to which it is obvious and transparent may be the most surprising part of this.
I think we just need a nickname. Maybe you can ask your podcast listeners for a nickname for that threesome. There's got to be something, because we're going to be watching the tech embrace of the Trump administration over the next couple of years. Good to talk to the Politico Tech podcast host, Stephen Overly. Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
You.